My name is Rosie. I'm the events coordinator here at Readers Books. This is by far the largest event and the most people I've seen in the store. In 2 whole years. So I want to thank everybody for being so flexible about still wearing masks while sitting down and for showing the cards. We're trying to keep on pace with what the Sebastiani is doing so that there can be some plaza solidarity. So I think the last 2 years have been really insane for so many different reasons. But I think you can't ignore the death of George Floyd and how that affected many liberal communities, especially ours. So as a bookseller, we can really see the trends of what people are thinking about. We like at many other stores, we started selling out of books that were about race, that were about how to talk to people about race, and we sold a bunch of them. But I think that conversation didn't necessarily go anywhere. I think people read them and tried to internalize it, but didn't try to externalize it because it's not an easy thing to talk about. And you worry about, am I going to offend someone by trying to talk about it? Am I going to end up being defensive, or are they going to be defensive? How to do this in a way that's respectful. So when Nancy came in and said, hey, I have this book, are you guys interested? I immediately went, yes, definitely, let's talk about it. Let's talk about race. Yeah. So I think most of you know her, so I'm not going to give a huge introduction with every incredible accolade on the list, but Dr. Nancy Dunn founded the Epoch? Is it Epoch?
Epic.
Epic. Sorry, I always get that word wrong. Foundation. She is an educator on this topic and is going to be the one to really explore this. So give Nancy a huge round of applause.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be home back in Sonoma. One of the hardest and easiest things that I've ever done was leave here. It was hard because of all the community that I was able to make, and it was easy because I fell in love with the most amazing man, and I'm now living with him in Montana, so who's now my husband. So it was yeah, you know what I'm saying. So thank you for coming out, and we are talking about my new book. It's my first book, Let's Talk About Race. It was just a little bit about what sparked it is I've been in this work. I started off as an educator, working with juvenile court and community schools in San Diego. And I realized in that moment that it was a passion for me to make a difference for those who were most at risk and most marginalized in our system. And what I began to understand as I worked with my students was that they were predominantly Black and brown in alt ed in the juvenile justice system. And I wanted to figure out not just how I could have an impact in my classroom, but how I could have a greater impact. And so this became truly my life's mission, is how do we support those most marginalized in our communities. For me, it started off around race, but also looking at folks with disabilities, looking at sexual orientation and gender identity, and all those groups of people who are marginalized, to figure out how I can contribute. And so you kind of fast forward it to every time I wanted to have more and more impact, and I finally got to the point where the impact was in actually starting my company, Epoch Education, and being able to go out and train. So one of the pillars of Epoch Education was what we understood was that people struggle to talk about these difficult things. We live in a society where we have been conditioned to actually avoid the most important conversations that we need to have, right? That we avoid them because it's not polite to talk about race, it's not polite to talk about politics, it's not polite to talk about religion, because we don't want to offend anybody and we don't want to be in conflict. And so what I realized was that there needed to be an easy way to remember how to have these conversations, because what we know for sure is we have to have them, right? And so the protocol was born. And it started off, it's recognize, interrupt, repair. And it was the 3 steps. And it seemed to me a very logical way to have these conversations. And so for many years, probably about, 8 to 10 years, I taught this protocol. And as I started to really lean into it and understand it and define it, I began to understand that there was a piece missing, and it was compassion. Right? We have these, I've got this great protocol that works, but what I was taking for granted was that it had to be laced in compassion. And so compassionate dialogue as a framework was born, because the RIR, recognize, interrupt, repair, could be, I recognize that you hurt my feelings. I'm going to interrupt you by calling you a jerk. And I'm going to repair it by never talking to you again. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose, right? And so compassion means that when I'm recognizing, I'm coming from this place of empathy and seeking to really understand not just the other person, but seeking to understand myself. Like, what's happening to me? What is it triggering in me? How am I showing up? And how am I possibly contributing to what I see happening, right? Or to the interaction that's taken place. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the book. And I am a little nervous, so just... Thank you. You know, it's funny, I do this for a living, and this makes me nervous right here. Okay, so this is from my introduction, and it starts off, why can't we just talk? All conservatives are racist. All liberals are socialist. We all know blacks and Mexicans are more likely to be criminals. I would never have guessed you were gay. Women shouldn't be leaders. They're too emotional. She's so unprofessional. She must be a millennial. There are two ways to look at how we communicate today. You could say that we've come a long way, which we have. You could also say that we have a long way to go, which we do. This is the first of many examples in this book that show more than one thing can be true at once, a concept that is still hard to grasp for so many of us. Just one piece of what hinders our collective inability to communicate effectively. How do I know? Because I've made my life's work to not only understand what's at the root of this problem, but also to find a way to fix it. And a fix, by the way, is desperately needed. Today, misconceptions run rampant across the country. Political correctness, which took hold in the 90s, has rendered us all but ineffective in our pursuit of communicating with one another. There is more gossip, hurt feelings, misunderstandings, and intolerance because we do not actually know how to engage with one another when it gets tough, as evidenced in the statements you have read a few seconds ago. And just to add a caveat is that those statements actually were solicited from clients. And the only requirement to put this statement in, and actually we have a few of the teachers who were with us when this happened from Nevada, was to say what was something that you've heard or that was said to you that you didn't, that bothered you, and you wish you would have said something, but you didn't know what to say. And in over a course of 3 months, we collected over 2,000 statements from our clients of those kinds of statements that I read at the beginning. So I don't have to make it up because we hear them every single day. And every day we don't know how to respond. Every day we hear them. And if you're like me, I always say, I'm a genius 10 minutes after the fact. Like I walk away and I'm like, I could have, I wish I would have, but we don't, because in that moment we're in that, the adrenaline's going and we get into that, fight or flight, and most of us fly. And not because we're weak, but because we're afraid, right? So I will continue. So why then can't we just talk? This is not a simple question with a simple answer. We all bring our personalities, learning styles, and lived experiences to the table. These factors and others, such as to whom we're speaking, power dynamics, and how we feel in the moment, all influence how we communicate, and rightfully so. There is a path forward, though. This path is compassionate dialogue. And because we know the right way forward can feel indistinct sometimes when it comes to these tricky interactions, I've also developed a protocol within called compassionate dialogue that acts as a signpost when you need it. A compass, a gut check. It's called the RIR, and I'm going to teach you in this book. And so that's kind of where it started and the pieces of it. And the most important part about the protocol when we think about it is practice. Just like playing an instrument, learning a language, playing a sport, what they all have in common is that we have to practice. But because we have been so conflict avoidant, we don't get practice in this. So every time we have this conversation, it feels like it's the first time we're having it. And so it becomes harder and harder for us to interrupt and engage and do it from a way that's compassionate, that actually leads us to understand each other instead of trying to be right or wrong. So, what do I hope that you gain? When I think about this book and writing it, it really is that opportunity, because one of the feedback that I got consistently was that, well, this is great when you're in the room. Like, we're in the room, it's safe, we get to practice, we get to make mistakes, everyone knows and assumes positive intentions, but when we're in the real world, it doesn't work that way. And so this is really that guide to allow you to take your time to really process, because I think that the biggest part that we have to consider is that we have to know ourselves. And I think when it comes to these interactions, we're usually pointing the finger out externally. So I hear something that triggers me, and I know in my body that I'm hurt, but many times I don't stop long enough to actually name what that feeling is, and then what my actions are because of that feeling, right? But I'm very quick to say, that was a horrible thing that you said, right? Or that hurt my feelings. Or why would you say that? But if we took a breath, and for me, I always say as a sage and a fire horse, that I have to ride my emotional wave, right? Because if I don't, I never come from a place of malice, but I can be pretty direct, and it can be hurtful even if it's not my intention. And there is something in that. There is a difference between intention and impact. I may not intend to hurt you, but if the impact is that I did, then I need to be accountable to that. And you need to hold me accountable to that so that I don't do it again, not to shame me, not to blame me, but to keep me from repeating it, right? And so it's important that we know ourselves and we know what our triggers are. So for me, I know that certain things will trigger me more than others. And the more I understand that, the more I can ride that emotional wave so that I can actually show up in compassion. And that is my goal, because if I can go there, even with someone who I think I have nothing in common with, we can find a way forward together. So I have a little story. This actually happened while I was in Montana during the height of COVID. And it was just prior to the election. So there was a lot of things going on. And this is not a political conversation. This is just my perspective. So, and I live in a very small town. My town is 500 plus people, 8 square blocks. And I'm one of probably 5 black people in the town. So I feel very conspicuous at times. And prior to the elections, I felt very much vulnerable being in my town. My town has always welcomed me. I've never had a problem, but I started to see Confederate flags pop up on certain houses. I started to see Trump flags. And so I was feeling a little vulnerable in my community. So I went to, as everyone does, we all have gardens, and I went to go buy some things to plant to keep me busy. And I ran into my plumber, who had helped me get my house together when I bought it. And he had a MAGA hat on. And I remember, so you see where I went, right? So the first part of the protocol is recognized. And I remember feeling in my belly, like it was disappointment, it was fear, it was frustration, it was a lot of stuff. And I was trying to figure out, do I even talk to him? Like, you know, but this is someone who's been at my house. He was at my engagement party. And so for me, I was like, well, you have this protocol, you have to practice it. And so I gave him a hug and did the niceties because I had to ride that wave. And I finally came up with my questions. So recognize, I shared all those feelings. And my question was, what does that hat mean to you? And he was taken aback a little bit. And he said, well, it doesn't mean what you think it means. And I said, well, what do you think? What do you think I think it means? And so he started to tell me about what he thought it meant, what it meant to him, and what he thought I thought it meant. And we had this really amazing conversation. And then he says, well, what does it mean to you? And I shared what it meant to me. And he says, well, I don't associate with those people like that. And I said, well, how do you know the difference?
And why are you wearing the uniform?
Well, that's like I said. So I said, how do you know the difference? And he stopped for a second. He goes, I guess I don't until I talk to them. And I said, and that's my point wasn't, and I think the biggest thing for me, and I love the opportunities where I get to lean into my own protocol, is that for me, I wasn't trying to change his mind. I wasn't trying to stop him from wearing this hat. What I was trying to do was understand who he was so that I could make a decision about who I wanted, if he was someone I wanted in my life. And at the end of it, we hugged to say goodbye, and I felt really, really good about the conversation. And I can promise you, I did not change his mind. And he did not change mine, but there was a level of understanding and respect about what it meant for each of us. And if it had an impact on him down the road, to be a little bit more thoughtful about impact, not intent, then I'm successful, right? And so for me, again, I don't know how it ends. I see him, we say hello in town, we still hug and say hello. I ask him how his wife Linda's doing, and we do that. And I can do that because I had that conversation. And I think in our society, too many times, because we think that we are so different from each other, that we will just ghost people, that we'll just decide we're not going to talk to them anymore. And what are we losing out on because we haven't had those conversations? And I remember a time in my 55 years, I remember a time about 20 years ago where you didn't have to have the exact same beliefs. You didn't have to be from the same political party to engage with each other. And so as we become more and more divided, it becomes more and more important that we're having these conversations, because the only way that we're going to see the change we want to see and that we need to see is going to be through communication and understanding, right? And there may just be a time where we just agree, well, that's one thing we're not talking about. But I know who he is, and I don't have to be afraid of him. And that's what was important to me. And so the protocol is really this tool that the more you practice, the more you are really able to build bridges rather than break them down. So I want to share one more piece from the book, because I think it's really important as I think about how do we move forward and why is it necessary that we're moving forward now. And look at that. It's the title of the chapter. Why should we move forward with urgency? In 2017, an activist named Bree Newsom climbed a 30-foot flagpole outside of South Carolina State House and took down the Confederate flag that flew there. There she was, a black woman high in the air shouting, "You come against me with hatred, oppression, and violence." A news outlet reported, "I come against you in the name of God. This flag comes down today." Underground, though, a far less quotable conversation was happening. Officers were discussing how to stop Newsom, how to get her down. Bystanders reported that they heard the officers decide to tase the metal pole Newsom clung to high above. Such an act would surely have caused her to lose her grip and fall, likely to her death. But they didn't tase it. Why? Because a white man was standing next to the pole. A white man who had accompanied Bree to the State House that day and who supported her mission, reached out and grabbed the pole once he heard the plan. Nobody talks about that man, but I think about him often and how he saved Bree's life. They were in it together. Both of them knew at some level that there had to be a white man there while a black woman made the climb. There had to be someone there willing to utilize his privilege in order for a revolutionary act to happen, for a marginalized voice to be heard. When are we, as people, willing to put our hand on the proverbial pole? Allyship in itself is extremely valuable, but there is a time when allyship must shift to co-conspiratorship. That's what James Ian Tyson did with Bree. It is that time now for us as a society. It has been that time for a long while, to tell you the truth, but there's no denying that we've reached a social and political inflection point at this time of the writing. If things were going to change on their own, they would have already. Not only can we not afford to go backwards, we can also not afford to languish in this new status quo rooted in discomfort and division. That division takes a toll on all of us as humans. We are more unhappy, lonelier, and less secure than the generations before us. We can no longer sit on the sidelines of change, and each of us has to find our way to be accomplices for those who are most marginalized. The only way forward is with urgency and fervor together. And look, you may not have to do what James Ian Tyson did, that's okay. but there are actions you can take that can significantly impact an outcome with some thought and intention. As Dr. Asa Hilliard said, we need will, skill, and desire, with desire being a critical component. We need to be vocal and not just people of color. It's time we see hands of all colors on that pole. How we make that happen starts with putting what you've learned so far into practice. And so with the book, the idea is, how do we get to the point where we build our confidence enough to put our hand on the pole? We can no longer afford to be silent. We are really at that point where I think that we get a choice, and pretty soon that choice is going to be taken out of our hands. And so who do we want to be? And who are we? And can we just have a little grace for people who we think are so different from us, and lean in and see if it's really the truth? It may be, and it may be that your repair is that these people don't belong in your life anymore. But how do you truly know that if you haven't tried to have the conversation? And what do we have to lose? We're a little uncomfortable, we're a little nervous, but we get over that and we move on. And that's the repair piece. The repair actually allows us to not only possibly heal the relationship, and sometimes I say repair is divorce, by the way, so let's be clear, right? But we also have the opportunity to heal ourselves. Because when we are talking about people, it's because we're not talking to them. And so if we can talk to each other, we can move on. And sometimes that repair is we're no longer good together. But most of the time, the repair is that you can find that common ground. You can find something that keeps you connected to each other. And in some ways, you can really deepen those connections. So all that's in here on some level. There are some nice pause and practices at the back of the book that, because I wanted it to be something that you could actually use as a tool to grow and learn. And so if you take time and not just try to, read through it, but actually read the chapters and do the pause and reflect and practice, then you can actually start to, build your own skill around having these conversations, and also get a good understanding of who you are and how do you show up. Do you run hot? Do you run cold? What is your normal MO? When things get tough, do you run? Do you stand your ground? What is it that you do? Because understanding that helps you move to the next level. All right. So with that, I'd like to open it up, because we're at that time for my part of it, and just say, are there any questions? I'd love to take a moment and answer any questions if you have them. Thank you. Oh, sorry, thank you. She asked if there was going to be an audiobook. And there is. It's actually, we're working on it now, but I will not be the one reading it this time. You see me right now, I'm a nervous wreck trying to read this. And so, yeah, we thought we'd have someone else read it, and then the next one or maybe another iteration. I'll be like Barack when he went back and did the first book, someone else read it, the second book, it was him, and so maybe I'll do that. Yeah, so, yeah. That's great. Yeah, thank you. What other questions do you have? Okay. So the question was, and I'll repeat it, and then I asked he asked if this was the timing of my book, if that had to do with all the outcry about critical race theory in schools and in public spaces, and it doesn't. It was truly just time that I write it. This protocol has been in development for about 15 years. I've been using it, and the more I used it, the more I learned. And then it just came time where I need to write a book. And I've been saying that for about 5 years. And finally, my COO and friend, Susan Callender, who's in the audience, was like, I'm tired of you talking about it. So if you really want to do it, I'm going to make it happen. And then 7 months later, it was getting published. So she doesn't mess around, and she's not for hire. So, but what I will say about the critical race theory is not about critical race theory, but I think for like anything, it's important to understand what it is that we're actually talking about. We have all these buzzwords that are going around, and most people can't even define what critical race theory is, right? Right. And most people can't. I know a lot about it, but mostly because I also taught it. And so I think the first thing is for us to take that responsibility to educate ourselves on really what it is. Read those books, read Derek Bell, read people, and know for yourself and make your own decision about what the problem is. But like anything, critical race theory is a theory. And I think we're in deep trouble when we start throwing out theories because we don't like what they say, as opposed to, let me rephrase that because that's not coming out right. When we start throwing out something because they make us uncomfortable. That's what I was getting at. And it is meant, theories, it's kind of like doing my dissertation and you have a hypothesis. And what is it about a hypothesis? You're not trying to prove something is right, because if you already know it to be true, then it's not worthy of your research. You make a hypothesis because you have an idea about what you think it is, but you could prove that your hypothesis is incorrect. And that is the whole journey of doing that whole process. And so if there's new thinking that helps something evolve and change and move, then we should be doing that thinking, right, about it. And then we should start asking critical questions about who doesn't like something and why they don't like it. Critical race theory is it is started in legal studies, right? And it was looking at the law. And basically, it was looking at how law actually perpetuated the inequities in society, right? And we know that to be true. And so it was a legal study. And then it was taken, people looked at it, people and educators looked at it and said, wow, this actually has implications to the institution of education, right? Where might we be in education perpetuating inequities? Because we know, up until, Brown versus Board of Education, black schools, and this, here's one, I'll do a quick thing and just give us an idea, and then we'll move off critical race theory, because I really want to encourage everyone to do that. But when you think about Brown versus Board of Education, raise your hand if you think it was a good legislation. It's not a trick question. People feel, okay, I'll say it again. When you think about Brown versus Board of Education, do you think it was good legislation? Raise your hand.
Good to have.
Good to have. Yeah, good legislation that was needed. Right. Right? And so what it did, it ended legally segregated schools. Right? So the downside, yes, of course it was good and it was necessary, but there were holes in it legally.
Yeah.
And what it meant was that who was educating black children prior to that? Who was doing it?
Black teachers.
Black teachers.
Right.
So when you desegregate schools and you have all black children and brown children go to white schools, who's teaching them now?
White teachers.
What happens to the black teachers?
Well, hopefully.
So when there's no more jobs for them. And so when we hear this myth about, the reason why there aren't more black and brown teachers now is because they don't value education, it is a myth. That legislation, the way it was written, destroyed one of the only few accessible professional occupations for black and brown people in this country. And when it was passed, we no longer had jobs. And so when we ask why there are no black and brown teachers today, we can look back on that legislation and understand that was an unintended or intended, depending on what side of the conspiracy theory you're on, consequence. That's what critical race theory does. It forces us to look closely at things like that and look at the impact of things that on the surface, we always say, if it's positively impacting communities of color, what are white communities benefiting from them? And it's just a question. They may not be benefiting from them, but it's a worthy question to ask because history has shown us that they have, right? And so that's all I have to say on critical race theory. But I really encourage you, if you want to know, read knowledge is power. And, I invite you all to come to your own conclusions about it, but through your own reading, not through Facebook, please, but through really picking up the originators and picking up those books and looking at it and forming your own opinions.
Well, I'm just going to say that I think the gift of your book is that it's a combination of having dialogue that engages one through the stories that you tell, but also that you present the practicality of communication.
Yeah.
The tools and the skills, which
Yeah.
You call the practice, and I think that's the loveliness of it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's the only way that no one person can do it, right? And so we all have to be willing to take our place in this conversation. And it's literally one conversation at a time, right? One at a time. And there's going to be times where you don't feel comfortable and it's not the right time to interrupt. And that's okay. There's no punishment, but it's about bringing to consciousness the idea that, wow, okay, if this comes up again, I know what I can say, or I know what I can do, or, I'm not going to let this go again because I've thought about it. Because so many times, and we're caught off guard because so many times when they come up, we haven't thought about what we would do the next time, right? But that's the planning. You can actually plan how you're going to interrupt. I invite you all right now, think about a situation that was difficult, whether it's with a person or with a colleague or just, with yourself, just a hard conversation that you had to have. Can you all think about it? Okay. How many of you had it? Raise your hand if you actually had it. How many of you are still thinking about having it? How many of you are still thinking about it but will never have it? Right? Yeah. Thank you for being honest. You're like, yeah. But that thinking, if you're still thinking about an incident or something that happened, whether it's yesterday or 10 years ago, that means it's still weighing on you. And when you can have, negative things and some trauma in your life, but when you deal and address the trauma, you get to let that go on some level. And it's when we still think about it that we realize we haven't let it go. And so what does that do to your body? What does it do to your psyche when you still carry around this stuff? And what happens a lot of the times is that you may say something to me and, it's innocent and, but you've triggered something in me and my response is out of proportion because you've triggered something that I haven't dealt with. And that happens a lot for us. So the more we do that self-work, the easier it is to have these conversations, right? Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah. So she said, how could the protocol be used to address microaggressions in the elementary classroom? And it's, so RIR is not original in that all I did was pay attention to how we engage in conversations, right? What happens really. And so our elementary kids are actually really good at recognizing and getting in touch with their feelings, which is really hard for a lot of adults to acknowledge those feelings, especially when they make us feel somehow less than. So just start, but you find it appropriate. The language is going to be different, but you can still have the conversations. And we have school districts using the protocol from first grade up, all the way through 12th grade. So it's appropriate. You just have to make the scenarios appropriate and the practice appropriate. And what would you say? And I think in a lot of ways we do that, but I think the repair piece is a piece that we don't do well, right? Because in elementary school, repair is like, I'm sorry. Right? Say you're sorry, shake hands, hug each other. Well, you know what? They're not sorry. You just forced them to say I'm sorry. They're not sorry. And so the repair is really about how do you get them to truly be sorry? How do you truly get them to have that empathy? What things can you do and show them so that they can understand what it's like to be on the other end of that? Right? Shaking hands and saying I'm sorry? No. Yes.
So, I don't know how to form this question. There's a term that is used, calling in or calling out, you're familiar with.
Yes.
In this situation, how do you determine when the right time to call somebody in is, meaning talk to them in private about it, or call them out, which is in the moment that the comment is made or whatever the action is that you feel like you need to speak up about? Because I feel like sometimes calling out can actually have the adverse effect of what your intention is for that person.
Her question was, when is the difference between calling in and calling out? I don't know if you've all heard those things, but calling in is like this invitation to have a conversation, and calling out is when you're actually holding someone accountable in the moment. I think that for me, this book is about calling in, right? It really is. And I don't think, when we're talking about people that we have to work with, relationships, it doesn't mean by using the protocol that I cannot be direct. So, and I think that's part of the misunderstanding is when we talk about compassion or we talk about empathy, people think that it's all like the warm and fuzzy. Well, these difficult conversations aren't necessarily warm and fuzzy, but they come from a place of, when I call out, I usually attribute that to somehow trying to shame or blame you. And so I can still be very firm with you and be very direct with you, but my goal is to actually heal and to let you know the impact that you've had and to heal and to seek to understand, like, where is that coming from? And so a difference may be, and somebody may call it calling out, but if you do something to me and I say, wow, and this is the protocol, that hurt me. Is that your intention? I think that's a call in. Like, I'm trying to get to it. You may feel it's a calling out, like, oh, here, but you did something to me, and I'm inviting a conversation. And so the thing is, and if we're in those places of anger and fear or whatever is coming up for us, we have to acknowledge this protocol doesn't make those things go away. What it says is that it's a way that we can still have those feelings and then still engage. Because if you hurt me, and I don't know how to do this, and this is not, by the way, the way, it is a way, right? But if I don't know how to do this, then you've hurt me, and now I've walked away, and now I'm talking about you, and now I'm trying to make your life hell, and now every time we walk by each other, we're not talking, and there's a lot of negative energy and negative emotions, and then we have to sit in the committee together, and I'm trying to sabotage you. Like, I can make a whole story about like what happens, when that happens. And so, I'm always calling in, and then, the call out part is the repair. So if we can't resolve it, I can repair and just say, you know what, I wish you well. I truly wish you well, but we can no longer interact anymore. But I just don't think that we have to go there. So when it becomes, and I guess the only caveat I'd make is that calling out would be appropriate when someone is actively, maliciously trying to hurt someone. I think that's different. But that's a whole different scenario. I'm not going to use the protocol. You're sitting there and you're, assaulting a woman, or you're assaulting a person. Doesn't even have to be a woman. You're assaulting someone, and I'm gonna call you out. I'm gonna call out. I'm gonna try to do whatever I can. So I think that is a caveat. The protocol is really intended for people who want, for most of us, who actually want to do the best we can. Who are trying to, and I still may have beliefs that you don't agree with. But I'm really trying, like my plumber. I mean, he's not a bad man. And I know he's not a bad man. And I know that more now because I've talked to him about it. Do we agree? No. But he's not evil. He's not horrible. And that's what the point of this is. So I think that those times to call out are the times when there is true malice behind actions. But if you're not sure, then ask questions first. And then you can be sure. Yeah, Nicole? Oh, yeah, this will be the last question? Okay.
How do we teach this younger generation that you can have a conversation with your plumber and that you don't have to just, negate that person and goodbye?
I think we have to model it.
Yeah.
Right? I think, I think it's always about, people. So I'm blessed to have my two mentees in the audience behind me, and these two young people, they don't like attention, but they have changed my life. And I think a lot of time, you'll have to ask them, but I think a lot of time I try to model for them what I wanted and what I needed and what I thought was best for them. And sometimes I would tell them, but at the end of the day, I think that it's in conversation with each other that we figure it out, and I just think that's the way. I don't think that if I came at them and they could tell you with, you need to do this and this is this, I don't know that I'd still be with them 7 years later, right? And so they're now 21 years old, and I started with them when they were 15 through Kathy Wickiwicki's program, Mentoring Alliance. And I'll never, will be forever grateful for you for that day that I saw you speak and I said you're going to give me that job. So I don't think that we don't tell them anything. I think that we show them. So thank you. That made me emotional. Thank you so much.